my lecture today, I'm going to present to you the Petroff defense. So this opening has a reputation of a very interesting one when black is trying to equalize, and I would like to present you some of the major ideas that both sides have in that system. So the opening first begins with the move e4 for white, and black of course responds with e5. So when white plays the move of knight f3, instead of defending that pawn on e5, black decides to counterattack the white own pawn. So he plays the move of knight f6, and the idea is that right now, if white decides to take on e5, black will actually hit the pawn on e4. So that opening was first analyzed by the Russian chess players of the 19th century, Petroff and Tianish, and actually it's a very counterattacking opening system. It looks passive in the beginning, like white has the tempo, he can get advantage, but literally later on black can take advantage of that and even receive some better positions. So right now the major move that white has in this position is of course to accept the pawn. So after knight takes e5, black has a couple of options that he can go with. So one option is to take the pawn, to take on e4. The other one is first to hit the knight with d6. And the third option is to play the move of queen to e7. So to attack the white knight and then eventually to take the pawn after that knight goes. So let's start first with the line which is considered to be bad for black, and that's knight takes to e4. So why the move knight takes to e4 is a bad one? Well, there are a couple of reasons. The first reason is that when black takes that pawn, right now white has the move, so he can move, and on the other hand, the e file is open right in front of the black king. So after the move of knight takes to e4, what white can actually do is the simple move of queen to e2. Now the question is that now, if black decides to bring the knight backwards, like on f6 or d6, with this move, white will just open a check, a discovered check with his own knight, and now black will practically lose his queen. Knight to c6 check, and he loses. The same thing happens if, for example, black decides to do something else. If he decides in this position to play something like this, let's say the move of pawn to d5, then practically white can just play the move of d3, hit on the knight and e4, and basically when that knight goes away, like black plays knight f6, the same thing will happen. Knight to c6 check is working, and black is practically losing his queen. So that's the question, and for this reason it's not really a preferable idea for black to go this way, and the only variation which is available for black and might be good after queen e2 is the simple move of queen to e7. So the question is that black counterattacks the knight on e5, and now when white decides to recapture on e4, black has a simple move with which he can basically attack on the white own knight and use that the current knight is basically pinned. So the e5 knight cannot move since the queen will fail, and in the same time black has the idea next move to take it, and of course he will achieve an equality from the opening, so there will be absolutely no problem for black. And after d6, actually white can take advantage, but he has to be very, very careful and play precisely. So the opportunity to take advantage should now be connected with the possibility to use that with the move of queen e7 and d6, black started a kind of own complications, having one tempo less. So basically when we are playing black in an open game, which begins after first e4 and e5, the first thing that we should care about is to equalize. So once we equalize, eventually then we try to take advantage. So the Petroff defense has another idea. So the idea in that opening is to counterattack. So eventually, when white attacks, he counterattacks, and this is not a bad idea, but everything should go very precisely. So only one mistake in such positions can actually fail the whole position. And yet, now black made it, so the mistake is knight takes e4. So now after d6, white can simply play d4, support that knight on e5, and when black plays something like f6 in order to add some new pressure in that knight, well, then basically white can decide and play in a very strong way with the move of knight to c3. Now, in general, black played f6 because if he doesn't really do that, for example, if he does something like the immediate d takes e5, white can simply take there, and he has the pawn more. Now, the queen is supporting that pawn, and everything goes wrong for black. So d takes e, knight to c6, and white can even protect it with bishop f4, or maybe even try to play for initiative. So it doesn't matter what exactly he's going to do. The important thing is that white will have an advantage. So that is not really a good way for black to go with. And the only hope could be f6. But even here, again, white is having more space, better activity. As you can see, already he has the full domination in the center. All of those squares are basically under white's control. He has 3 pieces over there, and eventually he can even try to increase the pressure of that square by developing his knight out. Knight b1 to c3. So now, after the move knight to c3, if black decides to capture on e5 with d6 takes e5, white can just simply go with knight d5, threatening on the queen, and again putting a threat against black. Now basically here he doesn't have the time to develop his pieces so quickly, and after he plays queen to d6, white can simply capture on e5, d takes e5, and after f takes e5, white can continue with the threats. Remember that in the opening, the initiative really plays a very good role. So basically the initiative presents the possibility to create threats in a row and for some time to prevent the opponent from making his own ideas, making his own development. So after f takes e5, white can simply play bishop to f4. Now of course there is the pin on that pawn, so black cannot take. And in case black decides to play something like, say, pawn to c6 or anything like that, white can even decide to castle long, and now he has a really dangerous, I can say even lethal attack against the black king. After the move long castles, if black decides to capture on the knight, white can continue with rook takes to d5. Now he has sacrificed a minor piece, but his all pieces are connected, and in general, they are making a lot of threats against the black king. Now there is a threat on the queen. Next move, white is going to take that pawn on e5, and it's really difficult to find a way how black will rescue. Let's see, if he plays queen to g6, probably tries to exchange the queens, we see that white can even continue with the simple move of rook takes e5 check. And if black decides to go now with king to d8 or something, white can simply continue with his attack, probably play rook to e8 check, and after king d7, he can play the move of bishop to b5 check. So now we see that practically the black king will be in a big trouble. There are absolutely no squares where it can go, and next move white can of course include the last piece into the attack. After knight to c6, he can play rook h1 to d1 with the check, and definitely the black king is in a big trouble. Now black cannot really save the game here. If he goes with something like bishop to d6, white is even not going to win any material, but he's going to checkmate the black king immediately. There is this simple move of queen to e7 check, and black cannot take with the knight since it's pinned, and he cannot take with the bishop because it's pinned also. So basically those two pieces coordinate their actions, and of course they manage to checkmate the black king there. So that's a very interesting variation, and particularly instructive. It shows exactly how it's gonna work if black is not careful exactly what moves he does, and he's simply making his own counterplay without caring how can white proceed and maybe take the initiative. For this reason, the move of knight e4 on 3 move is not really a good one. So after knight e5, what black should do is to think exactly what kind of move to do, and this is the move of d6. Now, one last thing, what about if black does not play d6 but plays queen e7? That's also a very bad move, because if black does this, basically he will block the development of his dark square bishop, and white can play the simple move of d4. He will defend on his knight at e5, then play bishop e2, castle on the short side, and definitely he will have a better development. So now, as you can see, black sooner or later will need to take that pawn on e4, and when that happens, his king on the center will be on the opened e-file. So definitely, when he remains on that open file and white already castles, he will put his own rook at e1, and with a couple of tempo moves like with bishop d3, bishop f3, etc. He's going to uncover the power of that rook, and eventually then the black queen and king will be in a really big danger. So that is why such moves like queen e7 should be ignored, because they don't really fit with the main strategy that black wants to do, and exactly this is to bring out the kingside pieces as quickly as he can. So that's bad. And what about the other possibility, for example, to play d6? Well, that seems quite a good move. Now, after the move of d6, of course, the white advanced knight should go, and d6 fits in with the very important principle that we should know, and this is when basically your opponent gets an own piece into your territory, like, for example, the own territory is up to the 4th rank, from the 1st to the 4th rank, and the opponent's territory basically presents from his 8th to the 5th rank, like this. What we need to do is always to try and bring more pieces into his territory, and in the same time try to force his own pieces to go out from our own territory. So the move of d6 exactly follows this particular idea, and when white goes with the move of knight of 3, he doesn't really have these dangerous threats, even when black decides to take on that pawn. So right now, if white plays the move of queen to e2, black can quietly play the move of queen e7, and we see that there is nothing dangerous that will happen. The black knight on e4 is actually being protected right now, and even if white decides to play d3 in this case, black can simply bring that knight back. So he can put it on f6 or even c5, and what will happen is that we have a kind of symmetry in this position, and black's idea is mainly to exchange the queens. If he manages to exchange the queens on some of the next few moves, black will totally equalize the game. He will experience no problems, mostly because he doesn't have any weaknesses. For example, if white goes now with the move of bishop g5, black can simply exchange the queens with queen takes to e2 check, and after bishop takes to e2, black can play the move of bishop e7, simply to defend that knight on f6. So definitely when it happens, white can decide to develop, but of course black will develop as well. Short castles, white can castle on the long side, and it happens a kind of normal position with like equal chances for both sides. Black can play the move of knight to c6, or maybe even the move of bishop to e6, and little by little black will begin to advance forward, and he has really good chances in this case. So I can say that the variation with d3 does not really promise to white such a big advantage, mostly because he does not have this knight on e5. He doesn't really have this really great opportunity to strike against black and create so many dangerous possibilities. So that's the point. If white does not really keep so active pieces into black's territory, his threats are not going to work. That's the major idea of the Petroff defense. So black is giving some time, but in the same time, what he wants to do is to bring his pieces quickly and in general to try and successfully counterattack on the white position. So queen to e2 does not lead to win in this case when the white knight is not on e5. Okay, but then what is the best way to continue as white? How should he proceed if he wants to take some advantage? Well, I don't really think that it's possible, definitely, to take some advantage in that opening, since the Petroff is a very solid system. But what I think is that white might try. He may create attempts to gain an advantage with more active possibilities. So instead of the move queen to e2, the best opportunity for white is in this position to go with the move of d4. So once white does it, basically his plan is to continue with the simple move of bishop to d3, castle on the short side, and use the knight on e4 to gain some more tempos for a quicker development. Now I can say that it's still not dangerous for black, because basically he has lost only one tempo. Now you should know that in the open games, basically one tempo could be crucial, but there are also such openings in which one tempo only is not enough to achieve anything, because basically one side which actually has this tempo does not have so many active pieces to provide such dangerous and sometimes even critical threats. So after the move of d4 in that variation, black can play the move d5, simply to support knight on e4 with an outpost. And when white plays the move of bishop to d3, black can simply continue the development of his own pieces with bishop to e7. So basically now his plan is to castle on the short side, and it's not obvious how white to achieve something definite. So after the move bishop e7, white can continue with the simple move of short castles. And right here, the strongest continuation for black is to play knight b8 to c6. So the point is that black wants to keep some pressure on the d4 pawn, and literally when white plays rook to e1, black does not want to retreat that knight, neither to defend it with something passive like bishop to f8, which will definitely lead to problems, because if black goes this way, white can even play pawn up to c4 and try to remove the main protector of that e4 knight, the d5 pawn. So when he plays c4, he can then exchange, and then when black recaptures with his own queen, the e4 knight will be in a real problem where it is. So in general, what black wants to do is to make something more solid. After the move of rook e1 and this position right here, what black can decide and do is the simple move of bishop c8 to g4. So this move actually pins on the white knight, and if here white decides to capture the knight on e4, he cannot really win anything, because after the move of bishop takes to e4, d takes to e4, and rook takes to e4, now black is getting the resource to play the simple bishop takes f3, and in fact when white recaptures with his own queen like this, black can simply take back the pawn. So in result from this whole exchange, basically black equalized the material, and if white goes with queen to d3, black can even decide and play knight e6. Now there will be no way for white to create some threats against the black king, simply because there are not enough pieces. We see that all of the white pieces on the queen side are basically undeveloped, so only the queen is there, and in general, only with that queen and the rook, you cannot create such definite threats against the knight on a6 and in one move to stop the black king from castling. So that's not enough really, and okay, how should white continue after the move of bishop to g4? Oh, the point is that here, white does not even need to take on e4. He can simply proceed in this position with the move c4, and his plan is to, again, destroy that pawn, after which the knight on e4 will experience some problems. So white will have two threats on that. After the move of c4, now if black decides to use that pin, which he has with his bishop on the f3 knight, and, for example, decides to play knight takes to d4, now, basically, white can play in this position the simple bishop takes to e4. So the question is that after bishop takes to e4, if black decides to recapture with that pawn, like here, he's going to lose material. How? Well, quite simple. White will just play the move of queen takes to d4 over here, and the problem is that now white is already with a piece up. And if black decides to capture the knight on f3, we see that the bishop on g4 is basically hanging, so the white queen from d4 can simply take there, and white remains with a huge material advantage. In the same time, for instance, if black decides after queen takes to d4 to take on that queen, with queen takes to d4, white can simply recapture, and again, it has 3 pieces against only 2, and of course black is a piece down again. So that's quite bad for black, and in general, this means that the pawn on d4 is currently untouchable. So after c4, black is forced to retreat his knight back to f6, and then white can decide and take on d5 already. So this is practically evaluated as an equal position, because after c takes to d5, now black's best opportunity here is to exchange on f3, like to weaken the defense on the d4 pawn, and when white recaptures with his own queen there, black can play the move queen takes to d5. So in this position we see that basically white has a kind of isolated pawn in the center, the one on d4, and black has good resources to develop some plan on that. But in the same time, one has better activities, one has more space and of course better control over the center. After queen takes to d5, white can either decide to use the move of queen to h3, which is kind of more complicated, and it's about to sacrifice the pawn, but to actually keep the queens and attack on the black queen, or to go with the kind of simple continuation, which is after queen takes to d5, the move of queen takes to d5. Now after this move, queen takes to d5, and the move knight takes to d5, basically white can continue with knight to c3, and in that kind of complicated endgame position, I can tell that in most of the positions, white is keeping really good chances. After knight to c3, knight d to b4, and the simple move of bishop to e4, white is having an advantage of pair of bishops, but of course black, as a compensation, black can use the white isolated pawn. Isolated pawn, we mean a pawn that actually does not have any own pawns aside. So since there are no pawns like on the E and the C file, we call that the one on D4 is being an isolated one. So black can eventually use to attack on that pawn, and as a compensation, white can use his pair of bishops, as we call it, the quality advantage, to create some threats in the open position. So that's why the position is considered as equal, and in my opinion, that opening system remains as one of the most interesting ones for black. And yeah, if you want to use it, you can play it for both sides. In general, you need to have one major idea in mind. If you intend to play the Petrov defense as black, you need to know that every move that you make should considerably be connected with your opponent's exact response. If you don't connect your moves with what your opponent is going to play, you're going to be in a big trouble for a very short time. In the same time, if you're playing white, always think how you can get your pieces quickly and probably try and make some advantage in the center. So if both sides play right, eventually the game will be equal.